The seven-headed deity. One of the great coincidences of the ancient world is a seven-headed deity, what you might call a hydra or a many-headed dragon, seemingly worshipped by various civilizations. From ancient Greeks to the Aztec, this seven-headed unknown being played a key part in religious worship. Menorah mentions a seven-headed hydra in the Bible, and a bizarre depiction of a seven-headed creature was even found in Russia, carved as an ancient petroglyph 5,000 years before today. But just what is this thing, and why were so many cultures fascinated by it? The truth is, we don't know. In Aztec lore, it is a fertility goddess named Chicomeocoatl, and she's described as a woman with 7 snake heads. In Mexico, archaeologists have found depictions of the goddess holding the sun as a shield. This shield looks identical to an object that also appears in a Russian petroglyph of another seven-headed creature. They're almost exactly the same, yet they were drawn thousands of years apart and on opposite ends of the earth. Next, we have to look at the goddess Manas from Hindu mythology. She is the goddess queen of snakes, also seen depicted with 7 snake heads sprouting from a glowing orb behind her head. Then there's the seven-headed deity called Mushman, worshipped by the Assyrians and the Sumerians. She also has 7 snake heads. And let's not forget the legendary Hydra from Greek mythology. The Greeks took it even further when they introduced Medusa. In the end, deities with 7 heads, usually snake heads, can be found all over the world. Different cultures, different places, and different times all have a similar mythical or godlike entity. I am happy to announce that this video is sponsored by Shudder. Spooky season is here. Time to get your horror on. And what better place to start than Shudder, also known as Netflix for horror. Shudder has already kicked off its annual 61 Days of Halloween, a 2-month supersized celebration full of new movies and series, like a new season of Creepshow, the series premiere of Behind the Monsters, horror noir, and much, much more. All of that fresh content is getting released on top of what is an already incredibly extensive library featuring all the horror classics. If you've been around for a while, you know I get scared easily, but I also love spooky and creepy stuff. I highly recommend this horror movie, Train to Busan, because who doesn't love fearing for their life as they rush toward death? It also has excellent reviews. For only $5.99 a month, you'll have unlimited ad-free access to Shudder's unique, exclusive, and original collection of great thrillers, horror, and suspense content across all of your favorite devices. A collection that includes must-see titles like Vicious Fun, The Mortuary Collection, and PG Psycho Gorman, plus all the best horror documentaries, as well as the hit Creepshow TV series from executive producer Greg Nicotero of The Walking Dead. Don't be scared and give Shudder a free try for 30 days. Go to Shudder.com and use promo code ORIGINS. That's SHUDDER.com. Promo code ORIGINS. Alien figurines. In Mexico, archaeologists have discovered plenty of interesting artifacts dating back to around the year 300. These pre-Columbian artifacts come in the form of statues, which look eerily similar to other statues found across the world in Asia. In Mexico, the statues depict human-like beings with odd, almost circular tube structures on their heads. While at first glance the tube things may look like hats, nobody really knows what they are. But the crazy part is that these statues from both Mexico and China have the same tube-like hat structures on their heads. Now, what could this suspicious coincidence mean? The first thought is that the two cultures got the idea for their sculptures from the same source. But how could this be possible when the figurines from China's Sanxingdui ruins date back 3,000 years? That's over 1,000 years earlier than the statues found in the Veracruz state of Mexico. And seeing that the people from ancient Mexico and ancient China never met face to face, the only reasonable explanation for the coincidence is aliens. Is it? I don't know. As outrageous as it sounds, the statues from both nations do appear to depict weird, not quite human humanoids. They also share many of the same attributes. Many would love to believe that they were inspired by aliens and maybe they visited both civilizations in the distant past, then were immortalized in each society's artwork. The more likely explanation is that the shape must have a deeper spiritual or practical purpose represented in a similar way by both societies. The Pleiades. The Pleiades is an open star cluster of over 800 stars, positioned 410 light-years away from us. The cluster is found within the Taurus constellation, and although there are nearly 1,000 stars in this group, there are 7 that stand out to us in the night sky. These are known as the Seven Sisters. Now, the Seven Sisters have been around for a long time, in both myth and reality. To the Greeks, the Pleiades represented the 7 daughters of Atlas and Pleione. After Zeus defeated Atlas in the war against the Titans, the god of Olympus sentenced him to hold the heavens on his shoulders. His 7 daughters were so distraught that Zeus gave them a place in the sky so they could be closer to their father. But this is only one of many stories about the Pleiades. The strange coincidence regarding this well-known grouping of stars is this: just about every ancient society came up with some great legends surrounding these stars, and in every myth or legend created about them, the civilization named them the Seven Sisters, the Seven Maidens, the Seven Girls, and so on. For thousands of years, civilizations that had no connection to each other came up with the idea that these stars represented 7 women. And there is almost no way this could be purely chance. How could the Australian indigenous people have come up with the same myths as the Greeks about some random objects in the sky? Elongated skulls. One of the most curious cultural coincidences from around the world is that elite ancient people would bind their skulls. Archaeologists in South Korea recently discovered an elongated skull very similar to those found in Mexico, Peru, and Europe. It seems the cultural phenomenon of purposely mutilating the human skull to make it longer and more prominent was more widespread than previously thought. The elongated skull was found inside an ancient Korean coffin from the 6th century and belonged to a woman. By analyzing the bones, researchers were able to figure out the woman died sometime in her late 30s and had been part of the Silla Kingdom, the dynasty that ruled all of the Korean peninsula from between 57 BC to until the year 935 AD. They also looked at the carbon isotopes in her bones to see that she had eaten mostly a vegetarian diet of wheat and rice. This is thought to be evidence of the Buddhist influence in the ancient Silla Kingdom. But the weird coincidence here is that she had a skull like an alien. It's hard to believe that the practice of cranial deformation somehow spread from ancient Peru all the way to the Korean peninsula. It literally doesn't make any sense, since these two cultures never had any contact with one another. So why did so many cultures from the past believe in the need for these large skulls? It was a complicated process that had to be started practically from birth, and could have dangerous side effects. Why do societies value this type of head shape? And why would this group want to stand out from the rest of their people? For many, the easy explanation is that they learned the practice from an outside source that contacted them. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. The Sphinx. When the Sphinx comes to mind, most people automatically think of ancient Egypt. But similar-looking sculptures have been found in other parts of the world and have been connected with numerous cultures, including ancient India, Persia, Greece, and Israel, just to name a few. So the question is, does the ancient Egyptian Sphinx share common roots with any of these other mythical characters, or do they happen to just look alike? All signs point toward the latter. For one, the creatures are at least slightly different from one another. The Sphinx-like animal from South India, for example, is a human beast called a Purusha Mriga. It's connected deeply to Indian mythology, and aside from looking somewhat like the Egyptian Sphinx at first glance, has little to nothing in common with it. Then there is the Greek Sphinx, which is slightly more like the Egyptian version of the creature, but still not the same. She is depicted as a lioness with a human head. The creature guarded the city of Thebes, making anyone who wished to enter or exit solve a puzzle. Anyone who failed to answer was killed, which amounted to a lot of people before Oedipus finally responded to her satisfaction and convinced her to go away. These are just a few examples of the various Sphinx-like animals that exist across ancient cultures, whose similarities appear to be quite the coincidence. The Inca Egypt Enigma. One of the greatest historical coincidences ever has to do with the Inca Empire and the ancient Egyptians. Even though there are thousands of miles between the two civilizations, they share a whole heap of similarities. Both cultures built pyramids aligned with the cardinal points of the universe. They both dressed their dead loved ones in brilliant pieces of jewelry, and they both used animals to symbolize all kinds of things in their societies. from power to death. And let's not forget mummies. Both the Egyptians and the Inca practiced mummification with a startling amount of obsession. They may have mummified their dead differently, but the very fact that both cultures came up with the idea to preserve dead bodies so that their souls could travel safely into the afterlife is a wild coincidence. It's true that the Inca practiced human sacrifice, and the Egyptians weren't quite so keen on that, but there are many similarities between these ancient people, including their main deity. In Egypt, the main god was named Ra, who symbolized the sun. In Peru, the Inca worshipped a deity called Inti, who also happened to be a personification of the sun. In fact, worshipping gods who were representations of the sun is a key factor of many ancient religions. Some people even say Jesus Christ is also a representation of the sun, with his death and resurrection being a clever way to describe the winter solstice. Of course, you can take similarities and coincidences quite far if you want to, so it is up for you to decide. What do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments below. Hitler and Napoleon. Adolf Hitler and Napoleon Bonaparte have some of the most surprising things in common. Yes, both were technically warmongering rulers of a European nation desperate to control the world, but their similarities go beyond that. Internet sleuths have pointed out it all comes down to the number 129. Napoleon was born in the year 1760, and Hitler was born in the year 1889. That's a difference of approximately 129 years. When Napoleon came into power, it was 1804. When Hitler came into power, it was 1933. Yet again, a difference of approximately 129 years. And the similarities just keep coming. Napoleon invaded Vienna in 1812. Hitler did it in 1941. Yet again, 129 years. When Napoleon was finally defeated for good, it was 1816. When Hitler lost the war for Germany, it was 1945. The difference is, you guessed it, 129 years. Of course, this doesn't prove anything tangible. It could just be an outrageous coincidence. Then again, it could be something spiritualists call synchronicity, when certain events sync up with one another for reasons beyond our own understanding. Napoleon and Hitler each came to power at the age of 44. Both attacked Russia 6 years later when they were 52. Both failed to take over Russia, and when they both lost the war, they were both 56 years old. Hercules, one of the most famous heroes in history, may very well have been a real person. I'm talking about the Greek hero Hercules, also known as Hercules to the Romans and to the rest of the world today. But according to some historians, the legends of Hercules may have originated from one or more real people in the very distant past. In fact, most ancient legends start with real historical events and real historical people, but as these stories are repeated over time, they become far more dramatic. In the case of Hercules, it's believed his story may actually be the oldest in all of the world's mythology, with its root in the prehistoric Stone Age. But here's the deal. Hercules may not have actually lived in Greece. The legend of Hercules is strikingly similar to other heroes spoken of in Mesopotamia and other parts of the Near East. Experts think the old Stone Age heroes may have been exaggerated by the Mesopotamians, then handed down to the Greeks thousands of years later. It's why Hercules is always seen wearing animal skin and carrying around a club. He's literally a caveman. When the Romans came along, they took Hercules and made him their own, and through the last 2,000 years, the hero has continued to evolve. There is no real coincidence here, just the amazing truth of how one Stone Age person's incredible life became a legend, a myth, and a popular icon over 5,000 years after he lived. I'm sure whoever he was, he would be shocked to learn that his story had so much impact it even was made into a Disney movie. The Third Eye. The Third Eye has a long history in India and Asia, everywhere that Buddhism and Taoism has spread. Evidence of a third eye can be seen in sculptures and paintings all across Asia and the Indian subcontinent. According to modern spiritualists, the third eye is an ancient power that every person possesses, and ancient cultures have known about it and believed in it for thousands of years. The third eye is accessible by any person and can endow them with a higher consciousness, a greater perception of the world around them, and even in some rare cases, clairvoyance. But of course, the exact definition of the third eye varies depending on which spiritualist you are talking to. Still, the third eye can be found in all Eastern religions, even Hinduism. It's clearly marked in statues by a dot in the middle of the forehead, and it's honestly quite hard to miss. But here's where things get a little strange. Archaeologists and historians have all but ignored the blatant proof that Mesoamericans knew just as much about the third eye as the people in Asia. Cultures like the Maya, the Olmec, the Aztec, and even the Inca knew about the third eye and incorporated it into their artwork and sculptures. It looks a little different than in the eastern part of the world, but a very distinct circular shape can be seen in the middle of the forehead on funerary masks, statues of gods, and on the giant head sculptures left behind by the extremely mysterious Olmec people. Richard Casaro, who loves to study these types of coincidences, is wondering why historians seem to have ignored this. But the coincidence is there for anyone to see. Ancient Sumerians in Ecuador. Carlo Crespi was an Italian priest who arrived in Ecuador in 1927. Crespi reportedly befriended a group of natives called the Jibaro, who shared hundreds of artifacts with him. Some were found in a cave known as the Cueva de los Tallos, deep in the Amazon rainforest. Many of them were gilded or made out of gold and contained what looked like ancient hieroglyphics. In 1960, the Vatican supposedly gave Crespi permission to open a museum in the city of Cuenca, but it burned down, and many of its pieces were lost to history. It's too bad, because if they were as authentic as the priest claimed, they might have demonstrated a link between ancient civilizations in the Middle East and the Americas. In fact, Crespi was convinced that people from the Middle East had contact with tribes in the New World long before Columbus or any other Europeans, and he saw his artifacts as proof of this belief. Many experts believe that this is all a fantastical story with no factual basis to it whatsoever. Others think that Father Crespi presented actual objects to the world, claiming that they were ancient, but that he manufactured them himself as a hoax. It's admittedly odd that a priest somehow had the time to explore caves and befriend the local non-Catholic populace. But it would have also been strange if he had had the time and resources to generate such an elaborate practical joke. Sadly, we will never know, since they allegedly no longer exist. Romulus and Moses. The story of Romulus and Remus, the alleged founders of Rome, shares some odd similarities with both the stories of Moses and the story of Osiris, the Egyptian god. The overarching theme surrounding all four of these ancient people is that they began their lives sent floating down a river as babies. All were sent away in the hopes of escaping one persecution or another, usually at the hands of a threatening male. To be quite honest, all these stories are almost exactly the same, from the foundations of ancient Rome to the religion of ancient Egypt and to the Bible. In the case of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers were sent down the Tiber River in a basket by their mother, Princess Rhea, who wanted to keep them safe from the evil king Amulius. They were ultimately discovered by a female wolf, who then raised them as her own. In the case of Osiris, he is tricked into entering a floating vessel by his brother Seth, who then locks him inside and sends him floating down the River Nile. He is eventually found by the Queen of Egypt and saved. Then there is Moses, who was also sent down the River Nile in a basket by his mother to protect him from the pharaoh who's trying to kill all the male babies. This time it was the pharaoh's daughter who discovered Moses and raised him as her own. Nobody knows why all these stories are so similar, though chances are they each gained inspiration from the other over thousands of years. Stonehenge's cousin. Across the water from Britain, there is a structure 4,000 years old that seems to be directly related to Stonehenge. It's a ringed sanctuary that was discovered in a small German village, something the experts are referring to as the cousin of Stonehenge. According to Archaeology magazine, the ancient structure can be found near Pomelta, sitting in the middle of a potato field. It's been undergoing excavations for the past 15 years. Archaeologists believe this structure was built either by the same people's descendants who built Stonehenge or by European visitors who witnessed the monument and went back home to build their own. After all, there are only about 300 years separating the two megaliths. The same rituals were likely going on at both sites, though researchers still have no idea what those rituals entailed. The purpose of both Stonehenge and its cousin in Germany remains a mystery. Keep in mind that both these structures were built at the beginning of the Bronze Age, a transitional period for humans in which we learned how to work metal, develop complex social structures, and to build wheels. But for some bizarre reason that scientists can't put a finger on, early humans were obsessed with building giant circles out of standing stones. And while most scientists agree it probably had something to do with the observable movements of the sun, there is no real way to know the truth. The Central Pyramid. Most of us are familiar with the iconic Great Pyramid of Giza, an amazing technological wonder with mysteries surrounding how it was built so long ago. But what almost no one knows is that the pyramid is also a geological wonder. It just so happens to be sitting in a rather geologically significant location, the exact center of the Earth. How this happened is beyond anyone's current understanding, but according to the experts, the Great Pyramid is one of the most accurately aligned buildings ever made by human hands. First of all, the pyramid faces due north with 3/60ths of a degree of error. However, this small margin of error is likely because by the time scientists were able to study it, the position had shifted over thousands of years. The really amazing thing is that the pyramid is positioned exactly at the intersection of the longest line of both latitude and longitude, placing it at the bullseye or dead center of the middle of the planet. How did the Egyptians do it? For them to have done this on purpose would be practically impossible. The ancient builders not only would have needed a sophisticated understanding of mathematics, they also would have had to be experts in geometry. And to take it a significant step further, they would have needed to know the exact dimensions of the Earth. Considering many people thought the Earth was flat back then, this is highly unlikely, making this world wonder's location yet another amazing historical coincidence. What do you think? Were the ancient Egyptians that advanced? Let me know in the comments below. Hand motifs. Paintings and symbols of hand motifs have been sighted almost everywhere in the world. Most are upwards of 10,000 years old, likely created by the most ancient people on Earth. But what's really strange is that almost all the hand motifs found in cave art around the globe are nearly identical. Hand paintings have been made in a variety of ways, such as with stencils, with paint sprayed from the mouth, with charcoal powder, or with paints and brushes. Still, the results are eerily similar, with the handprints of men, women, and children being found on prehistoric cave walls from France to Argentina. What anthropologists can't figure out is the significance behind the motifs. Why did basically every branch of humanity decide to paint their hands on cave walls? Did it have something to do with a mysterious ancient ritual? Is it all just a coincidence? We have no definitive answers. And here is another bizarre part of the mystery. Many hand paintings have been found with a missing finger. In other words, whoever made the cave paintings was either missing one of their fingers or chose not to put it. Whole groups of people with just 3 fingers and a thumb have been leaving their handprints on the rock. Experts have guessed that it could be some type of sign language or symbolism. Other experts believe some primitive people were mutilating themselves on purpose by cutting off one of their fingers as part of a gruesome ceremony. When death runs in the family, the Hoover Dam straddles the Arizona and Nevada border. It was one of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's many projects that he commissioned as part of his efforts to help lift America out of the Great Depression. The structure was built to help with flood control, provide irrigation water, and produce hydroelectric power. There are many legends about the Hoover Dam, including an infamous tale of some workers' remains being encased in concrete. That never happened, but many men did lose their lives during the project. Nobody knows exactly how many workers died during the construction of the dam, but the official count is listed as 96. But many people believe that the number is actually much higher than that. The men who lost their lives at the job site succumbed to numerous causes, including drowning, blasting, falling debris, being hit by heavy equipment, and other tragic industrial accidents. John Gregory Tierney was one of the first workers to die. He perished in a flash flood that barreled through the Colorado River on December 20th, 1921. Exactly 14 years later, on December 20th, 1935, Tierney's only son, Patrick William Tierney, also died while working on the Hoover Dam. He fell to his death from an intake tower on the Arizona side of the structure and was one of the last workers to lose their lives while working at the site. The Lady of Elche. The Lady of Elche is a mysterious artifact discovered back in 1897 on a private Spanish estate. To this day, nobody knows the exact origin of the artifact, with some saying she may have been an Iberian princess, a goddess, or just a simple statue. She is considered to be one of the most outstanding examples of sculpture artwork ever found from the ancient world. It was actually a young farmer who came across her while clearing an area on the farm for plants. But here's where things get a little strange. The statue of the Lady of Elche looks almost identical to Princess Leia from Star Wars. She has the exact same coils of hair and arguably a pretty similar face. But the coincidences go beyond science fiction. One of the main theories surrounding the Lady of Elche is that she was a representation of an Atlantean goddess. One of the reasons for this is that the statue is simply too well made to have been crafted in Spain during the pre-Christian era, according to some. The detail and curious headdress is just too intricate. Most archaeologists agree she was carved around the 4th century BC, and that at the time, she was decorated in vivid colors of red and blue. But it's the exquisite artwork that makes people think she may have been from Atlantis, since no other people of the time, at least none in Europe, could have crafted such a beautiful piece of artwork. Of course, this is not really giving much credit to the people of the ancient world, who I think were much more advanced than we give them credit for. Cosmic coincidence. If you've ever looked up at the night sky and thought to yourself, that can't be real, there's no way, you're not alone. Space is a strange place, and so too is our very own moon. In fact, the moon has so many strange coincidences, it almost seems as if it was placed in its exact spot on purpose by someone who was extraordinarily good at math. The real coincidence has to do with the size of the moon, the sun, and the position of all 3 celestial objects. You've probably seen an eclipse at least once in your life, and you may have wondered how the small little moon was able to blot out the sun. After all, isn't the moon significantly smaller than the sun? The answer is yes. The moon is 400 times smaller than the sun. Coincidentally, the moon is 400 times closer to Earth than the sun is. These are exact numbers we're talking about, making it seem somewhat impossible that things ended up the way they are. The only reason that eclipses work is because of the number 400. If the moon was only 399 times closer to Earth, a full eclipse would never be possible. Biblical archaeology. In 1846, an Assyrian obelisk was found in northern Iraq. On this obelisk was a reference to Jehu, the Hebrew king from the 9th century BC. It was the first time that an archaeological discovery corresponded to something written in the Bible. Ever since, more and more archaeological discoveries have corroborated stories, people, or events in the Bible. In fact, in 1959, Rabbi Dr. Nelson Glueck declared that not a single archaeological discovery has contradicted a reference from the Bible. What this means is that nothing ever found has disproved a biblical story. Archaeology has done nothing except confirm stories and myths spoken of in the most popular book ever written. Now, is this a coincidence? If it is, it's the biggest one in history. Back in 1968, an ancient home from the 1st century was identified as the real house of the Apostle Peter. And in 1990, there was an ossuary discovered with the inscription of the name Caiaphas, the high priest who instigated the execution of Jesus. In 2021, scientists learned of a cataclysmic event in which an asteroid decimated an ancient city from the Middle Bronze Age, which likely inspired the tale of the biblical city of Sodom. Dr. Stephen Collins, who was involved in the investigation, says the ancient city was literally melted by an exploding cosmic airburst, resulting in destruction equivalent to 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. But because the ancient people hadn't known that, they simply thought it was God smiting the whole city. Basically, all of these archaeological discoveries point to one truth. The stories in the Bible, though probably not 100% accurate, were often at least inspired by real historical events. The Chinese Sphinx. There is a crazy historical theory floating around that China was created by a group of Egyptian migrants thousands of years ago. The theory says the Egyptians, or at least the great descendants of Egyptians, made their way to China and brought with them some of their culture, which gradually morphed into ancient Chinese culture. There isn't much proof of this, other than some pretty strange coincidences. For example, an ancient tomb in northwest China has revealed a sphinx carved from marble that looks incredibly similar to the famous sphinx in front of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The cemetery was uncovered on what was once a route along the Silk Road. The statue is just over 1 foot tall, with the face of a human and the body of a lion. According to an epitaph found inside the tomb, the body buried here was Liu Jun and his wife, who had lived sometime during the Tang dynasty between 618 and 907. They didn't necessarily do anything of major historical importance, But the fact that their remains were guarded by a sphinx is extraordinary. According to Fan Jun, the head of the excavation team, sphinx are highly unusual in Chinese tombs from this particular period. Nobody really knows where they got the inspiration for the sphinx, or if it does indeed have ties to ancient Egypt. There were over 150 artifacts taken from the tomb, with only one of them being linked to the art of the Egyptians. So it must have been quite special. A meteor hits the Comet family's home. A person has a 1 in 1.6 million chance of being hit and killed by a meteorite, according to National Geographic. It seems even more unlikely that one of these space rocks would strike the property of someone aptly named Comet, or Comet if you speak French. But this is exactly what happened in 2011, when a tiny 4.5 billion-year-old meteor smacked into the suburban Paris home of a family by that name. The Comets discovered the 3.1-ounce rock after they returned home from vacation and noticed water stains in their ceiling. They called a roofer, simply hoping to find out where the leak was coming from and get it fixed. The man who came to do the work found a heavily smashed ceiling tile. Speaking with reporters, 32-year-old family matriarch Martine recalled that the roofer told her it would take someone as strong as Superman to break the piece to that extent. He poked around the home some more and found the blackened meteorite. Suspicious that the object had come from outer space, the Comets contacted an expert named Alain Carrion, who's written numerous books about space rocks. He examined the specimen and confirmed that it was indeed a meteorite. Carrion speculated that the chunk that flew into the Comet's home was a type of meteorite called a crondite. Carrion explained that in the last 400 years, only 40 meteorites were known to have landed on French soil. The Comet's meteorite was the first to ever hit within 50 miles of Paris in recorded history. Add the family's space-like name to the mix, and the already surprising situation becomes even harder to believe. What would you do if you found that a meteor had crashed through your roof? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. We've got lots more videos coming up. Chinese mummies. I already told you about the similarities between the Inca and the Egyptians, but did you know that China also had quite a bit in common with Egypt? One of their biggest similarities was that they also turned their dead into mummies. Egyptians wrapped their dead pharaohs in cloth and covered them in gold and artwork, burying them deep in the ground in chambers, while the Chinese wrapped their dead in cloth as well, but covered them in suits of jade before laying them to rest deep in caves. The Chinese process involved encasing a member of royalty in over 200 plates of jade, weaving them together with silver threads. But Egypt and China have far more in common than just how they prepared their dead. Both cultures kept dogs as pets. They both cherished luxury items and had a fascination with oils and perfumes, and they both had cults to the dead. While the complex rituals and funerary customs weren't exactly the same, both cultures had a disturbing fascination with death and what came after, and invented rituals to make sense of the underworld. Which way do you prefer? Bandaged mummies and golden sarcophagi, or jade-plated mummies? Let me know in the comments below. And now for number 5. But first, it's shout-out time! Want to give a big thank you to Wakis Bashir and Tommy McKean. Thanks so much for your support. We wouldn't be here without you. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like these. Alien skulls around the world. During the 5th century AD, people all throughout Central Europe were practicing skull deformation. They would elongate their skulls by binding them with some kind of wrapping, or even just a pair of hard wooden boards. The result of these skull modifications initially led archaeologists to believe they had stumbled upon alien skeletons when they were first discovered. For example, there is a graveyard in Hungary excavated in 1961, in which scientists found a massive collection of elongated skulls. What appeared to be alien relics were actually the remnants of a community of people who deformed their heads for unknown reasons. Now let's go to Mexico, where a very similar cemetery was excavated in 1999. This cemetery was found by residents of a small Mexican village called Onavas. They discovered it completely by accident during the construction of an irrigation canal. 25 human burials were uncovered, with 13 of them having those elongated and deformed skulls. At the time, they seemed to be the skeletons of aliens. Even worse, these ones had mutilated teeth, the result of filing the teeth into unique shapes. But these are hardly the only deformed skulls that have ever been found. According to what scientist Corina Nipper told Life Science, skull modification can be traced all the way back to the Paleolithic era, also known as the Stone Age. It spread across the world in the 2nd century BC. It moved from Central Asia all the way into Europe, becoming relatively popular during the last days of the Roman Empire. But why? That's the real question. Why was it so popular for so long? And how did people living in Central America and South America come up with the idea to do the same thing? The inspiration behind these body modifications is a mystery, but it's likely that the practice simply stemmed from what was deemed attractive at the time, much like the practices of foot binding, piercing, and tattooing. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Egypt and Mesopotamia. Egypt and Mesopotamia rose to power just after the Neolithic period, with each civilization growing alongside a mighty river. And while there were some serious differences between Egypt and Mesopotamia, the largest being the fact that Egypt was governed by a single pharaoh, while Mesopotamia was a group of autonomous city-states, there were some real, coincidental similarities. The biggest similarities had to do with the culture of the civilizations. Both Egypt and Mesopotamia created their own systems of writing that looked eerily similar. Both these ancient places started writing using pictograms, and they used these pictograms primarily for keeping records. In both places at around the same time, they developed schools in which young boys were trained as scribes. They were taught how to use the pictograms, which ultimately turned into hieroglyphic systems of writing. The language was completely different, yet composed of the same characters and ideas. The thought was to take images that meant something and use them to convey information. But keep in mind, even though there are coincidences to be found between these civilizations, they were quite different. Even their religions were dramatically different from one another. Mesopotamians believed in angry gods that frequently plagued humanity with calamities, while the Egyptians believed in gods based on nature and the environment that granted prosperity and harmony to humans. However, it looks like they both strongly believed in the power of writing things down, or at least drawing them, for future generations. Egyptians and the Mayans. Speaking of a bizarre connection with the Egyptians, here's something that will shock you. The one culture on Earth that has the most in common with ancient Egypt is undoubtedly the Maya. Not only did both of these cultures build some of the most impressive pyramid structures in the world, they also both used hieroglyphic writing systems that were shockingly similar. Yes, it's true that the Mayan pyramids were built thousands of years after the Egyptian pyramids, but that doesn't change the fact that the Maya never met the Egyptians and still found a way to copy them from across the ocean. To give you a rough timeline, the Egyptian pyramids were built 2,000 years before the ones found in Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize. But what about the hieroglyphics? It seems unbelievable that two cultures separated by so much time and distance would come up with almost the same system of writing, yet it's true. The Egyptians and the Mayans used special symbols to convey thought and meaning. The Egyptian hieroglyphics were significantly more intricate, found on everything from pieces of jewelry to shards of pottery. Mayan hieroglyphics were mostly carved in stone and are considered more basic and primitive. Still, it's the core nature of the writing itself that counts. Even separated by time and space, the Mayans managed to follow in the footprints of the Egyptians. And now for number 5. But first, want to give a big shout out to Jeff Soltis. I'm so glad you're enjoying the animations. And to Chris Crow. Thanks so much for supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe for more videos like these. Keeping it in the family. After getting engaged during the early 2000s, Helen Kim and Stephen Lee brought their families together in New York City to celebrate the good news. While looking at family photos, the couple learned that Stephen's father and Helen's mother had dated in Korea during the 1960s. In fact, the couple had nearly gotten engaged, but they broke it off because their families disapproved. When Stephen's mother learned of the connection between her late husband and Helen's mother, she told her son that if she had known about it earlier, she wouldn't have supported the relationship. Stephen, on the other hand, didn't seem to mind the strange new family dynamic. His father passed away when he was 17, and he didn't know a whole lot about the man's past. Helen's mother was able to shed some light on what Stephen's dad was like during his 20s, before his parents met, and before he was born. Stephen's in-laws believed that his father somehow acted from beyond the grave to make sure the two families crossed paths. Regardless of how it happened or any obstacles the situation presented, the couple is still married. In a 2020 update on their lives posted to Medium, Stephen wrote that he and Helen are very much still in love, and that they're happy together, despite having gone through some difficult times. Vikings in South America. We know today that the Vikings made it to North America before any other Europeans. They traveled to Greenland, where they set up settlements and lived for decades. They also made it to the tip of northeastern Canada, to the island of Newfoundland. Here, they set up the first permanent European settlement, known today as Lansdowne Meadows. They never spread through the rest of Canada, but they did make it here first. And, as if by coincidence, some experts say the Vikings even made it to South America before any other Europeans. The best evidence comes in the form of dog bones. French scientists Madeleine Friand and H. Reichland investigated dogs that were mummified sometime before the Spanish conquest of South America. They were shocked to see that the dogs hadn't actually come from America, but rather from Denmark. They weren't descendants of wild Amazonian dogs, they were descendants of Danish sheepdogs. The suggestion here is that the Vikings arrived with their dogs a long time ago, then left some behind before they vanished. And here's another striking coincidence. At the archaeological site of San Agustin in Colombia, researchers found Viking runes carved on stone statues. Then again in Peru, runes were found on urns crafted by the Nazca people. These runes are identical to what the Vikings used at home, meaning they had likely stopped by in South America and interacted with the locals. Where they went after or how they even got there is a huge mystery. Mysterious dwarf houses. For around 2,000 years through the Northwest Caucasus and Russia, thousands of ancient dolmens were built. These ancient stone buildings were called ispun by the locals, which translates roughly to House of Dwarves. The Caucasus spans much of the land between the Black Sea and Mount Elbrus. And when I say dolmen, I mean an ancient megalithic structure made from stone blocks. A dolmen usually had a single chamber, one large stone as a ceiling, and a small access point. No matter where the dolmens were made, they were almost always the same. And this brings us to the coincidence. Throughout the wastelands of Russia, scientists have found no less than 3,000 dolmens. They were used explicitly for human burials. But scientists have also found dolmens in other parts of Europe, in Korea, and throughout mainland Asia. The coincidence is that all these ancient cultures started building nearly identical stone dolmens or dwarf houses at the exact same time, and for the exact same reason. But we just don't know what it is. Ancient tongues. The tongue is a very weird organ. In ancient Tibet, monks would stick their tongues out as a kind of greeting. It revealed to other people that you were good and that you weren't a demon with a secret black tongue. For cultures like the Maya and the Aztec, sticking out your tongue could be a gesture of violence. No matter where you go in the world, all ancient cultures associated sticking your tongue out of your mouth as a way of conveying meaning, which could be either a good thing or a bad thing. There is no better evidence of how important tongues were to ancient people than in the artwork they left behind. The Aztecs, Mayans, Celts, Indians, and so many others left behind countless depictions of gods and men sticking out their tongues. In fact, many statues of their gods have their tongues sticking out, usually as a symbolism for bloodlust. But even though the tongue has been so important for so long, archaeologists and historians still don't quite understand why. What do you think the human fascination is with sticking out your tongue? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. We have lots of videos like these coming up. Greek and Roman gods. You may have noticed there are some serious similarities between the Roman gods and the Greek gods. This cultural coincidence is actually more of the Romans absorbing the Greek pantheon. For example, the Greeks had Zeus, and the Romans turned Zeus into Jupiter. Both were the king of the gods and wielded magical lightning bolts. The goddess of marriage in Greece was Hera, and in Rome it was Juno. The Romans had Diana for the goddess of hunting, and the Greeks had Artemis. But how did this happen? As you can tell, this is much more than just a coincidence. The Romans didn't just incorporate Greek beliefs, they stole them and then renamed them. The story of how this happened starts in 146 BC. The Romans invaded Greece at a time when they hadn't really developed their own gods yet. The Romans were acutely aware that trying to conquer Greece and keep it conquered would be infinitely more difficult if they tried to impose their own gods on them. So the Romans simply adopted the Greeks' beliefs and then let their gods and deities mingle with their own. But even before the Romans invaded Greece, they were both stealing gods from other ancient cultures. Rome took Isis from the Egyptians and renamed her Magna Mater. Even Greece stole the Hittite god Apollonius and renamed him Apollo. The list goes on and on. Historical synchronicity. There are some pretty strange historical coincidences from more modern times, such as the fact that Stephen Hawking was born on the 300th anniversary of the death of the great scientist Galileo Galilei, whose death occurred on Einstein's 139th birthday, March 14th, when the calendar reads 3.14, which equals pi. Coincidence? Or historical synchronicity? We can take it a step further even. The first king of Rome was Romulus, and the first emperor was Augustus. When the Roman Empire finally fell, the emperor who was watching it burn to the ground was named Romulus Augustus. That almost seems too absurd to be a coincidence. Fast forward a few thousand years, Thomas Jefferson died on the 50th anniversary of America's birthday, July 4th, and so too did John Adams. And yes, James Monroe also died on July 4th. All three of these men were the founding fathers of the country. Turn to the great Mongol Empire, we can see that Genghis Khan rampaged through much of Eurasia and killed heaps of people. His direct descendant was a guy named Amir Timur, who died in 1405. He ruled the Turco-Mongol dynasty. Way later, when archaeologists with the Soviet Union uncovered his tomb in 1941, there was an inscription that read, "Whoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." 2 days later, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. The point behind all of these historical coincidences? Well, there really isn't a point. It's impossible to say whether these things happen because of some divine synchronicity, some obscure mathematical probability, or for absolutely no reason at all. The suspicious license plate. World War I began with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria. While riding in his car with his wife, he was shot and killed in the city of Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. His assassination triggered a series of events that would plunge the world into war and chaos. The car that Franz Ferdinand was riding in had a license plate. The number on the plate was A111118. Pulling these digits apart can represent them as 11-11-18 or November 11th, 1918. Coincidentally, this was the exact same date that the armistice was signed to end the war. In other words, the numbers on the license plate of the vehicle in which the Archduke was riding in, the man whose assassination started the war, were the same numbers as the day that the war ended. It's a bizarre coincidence that doesn't mean much, but it is still pretty spooky. Amazingly, nobody even noticed the coincidence until 2004, when Mike Dash, a writer for the Smithsonian Institute, was at the museum in Vienna where the infamous car is still on display. He noticed the numbers on the plate. He put the numbers into context, noticing a strange coincidence that people who had been working at the museum for decades had missed. What do you think about this? Let me know in the comments below. The Indian Sphinx. When we think of the Sphinx, we think of the huge mythical creature depicted sitting in front of the Great Pyramid of Giza. But even though sphinxes are synonymous with Egyptian culture, they have been found in other places on Earth too. There have been plenty of ancient sphinxes found throughout Greece, and this isn't really a surprising coincidence. Greece and Egypt have had a long and sometimes violent history, with their cultures and artistic styles often getting mixed together. A really strange coincidence is that in India, you can also find carved sphinxes from ancient times that look shockingly similar to the ones in Greece and Egypt. Particularly, you can find mysterious sphinx idols at the famous Nataraja temple in Chidambaram. The sphinxes here have the bodies of a lion and the faces of humans, believed to represent sacred and secret knowledge. They are located near the entrances of shrines and temple gateways, acting as guardians for these ancient sites. This is much in the same way that the Sphinx in Egypt guards the Great Pyramids. The big issue here is trying to understand how a hybrid beast made of a human and a lion was thought up by both Egyptians and the earliest Indians, and why each culture used these specific mythical creatures to protect their most sacred places. Pine cones. Pine cones have been used by more ancient civilizations than you can ever imagine. They were considered symbols of fertility by the Assyrians, the Romans, the Greeks, and even the Christians. It's one of the most prevalent symbols anywhere in ancient cultures. The staff of Osiris has a pine cone at the top. Hindu gods are usually shown holding pine cones in their hands, and Assyrian carvings from over 3,000 years ago depict pine cones being used as fertilizer for the tree of life. It also goes to the other side of the world, with statues uncovered in places like Mexico depicting pine cones. So, what's the deal with the pine cone? Experts theorize that the pine cone is associated with the pineal gland, or what some refer to as the third eye. But it goes even deeper than that, with multiple ancient cultures associating pine cones with eternal life. The Aztec god of corn, Chicomecoatl, is seen in statues holding the pine cone and the evergreen leaf as symbols of agricultural life. But it's a bit different with the ancient Celts and Romans, who thought of pine cones as fertility symbols. Celts used to put pine cone fertility charms under their pillows at night, and Romans gave them as offerings to Venus, the goddess of love. The weird thing is that nobody knows why so many ancient cultures adored the pine cone. It's a total mystery that doesn't have much hope of ever being solved. The Jim twins reunion. Jim Lewis was adopted in 1940 at just 3 weeks old. He grew up in Lima, Ohio, where he enjoyed a fairly standard childhood. As a schoolboy, he disliked spelling but developed an interest in carpentry and math, and he had a dog named Toy. Lewis married a woman named Linda, but they eventually divorced. His second wife's name was Betty. He fathered a son named James Allen Lewis and spent his adulthood chain-smoking, working as a security guard, and driving a Chevy. And here's where it gets super interesting. Jim Springer was adopted in 1940, less than 45 miles away, in Piqua, Ohio. Spelling wasn't his forte, but he enjoyed math and carpentry. As a child, he had a dog named Toy. Does all this sound familiar yet? Springer married and divorced a woman named Linda, married a second time to a woman named Betty, and had a son named James Allen Springer. He pursued a career as a deputy sheriff, was a chain smoker, and drove a Chevy. Jim Lewis and Jim Springer were twins who were separated at birth, and they didn't meet until they were 39, despite having so many things in common and not living far from one another. Lewis tracked his brother down after finding out that he existed, and the two finally came face to face in 1979. They discovered that they had even more in common than they realized, including a proneness to tension headaches and a nail-biting habit. The twins smoked the same brand of cigarette and even vacationed on the same beach in Florida. Researchers were fascinated by the pair, who agreed to participate in some nature versus nurture studies that sought to understand the roles that child-rearing and genetics play in how separated twins turn out. Their brainwave and personality tests turned up virtually identical results. Springer and Lewis definitely shared a twin bond. Their connection was instant, and they became lifelong friends. Ancient calendars. There are two ancient calendar systems that share so many similarities it seems almost impossible that they developed independently of one another. At least that's what researcher David H. Kelly says, the guy who published a paper on the subject back in 2016. David is a Harvard-educated archaeologist from the University of Calgary, meaning he really knows his stuff. But his paper was still controversial. He claims the two calendars indicate direct contact between the civilizations in Eurasia and those in Mesoamerica. This is about 1,000 years ago, and obviously it would turn everything we've been taught by mainstream archaeologists on its head. David believes it may have been the pre-Columbian societies that actually made it to Asia, since they did have quite a lust for exploring. It could be that they traveled all the way to Asia, where they stole the idea for the calendar from the Chinese, and then went back home and made their own. The similarities between the two calendars are many. For instance, the days are associated with elements like water and fire, along with animals. They even correspond frequently between the two systems. Days associated with the deer, dog, and monkey are exactly the same in the Mayan and Chinese calendars. Even more shocking is that the same day associated with the jaguar in the Mayan calendar is associated with the tiger in the Chinese calendar. And the same goes for the Maya representing one day with the crocodile and the Chinese representing the same day with the dragon. Coincidence? What do you think? Twin typhoons. The great Mongol army of Kublai Khan should, in theory, have decimated Japan in the 13th century. The Mongolian Empire had taken down every single army that they went up against at the time. They had already conquered most of China and the surrounding regions, and were setting up to be the greatest power ever seen on Earth. So why didn't Kublai Khan ever take control of Japan? His invasion of the island nation failed because of a pair of bizarre coincidences that are honestly hard to believe. If Kublai Khan had taken Japan, history as we know it could look much different today. However, the truth of the matter is that when the Mongolian fleet tried to land in Japan in 1274, they were battered away by what the Japanese called divine kamikaze winds. The fleet was forced to turn back because of an uncontrollable typhoon. When they tried the invasion again 7 years later in 1281, the same thing happened. A typhoon pushed the army back once again. In the 7 years between, there hadn't been a single typhoon. It was as if some divine presence was pushing the Mongolian army away. After their second failed attempt, they simply gave up on Japan and went on to do other things. Race of giants. Humans have long told stories of giants walking the earth. The wildest part is that these stories of giants have been told by civilizations on all sides of the globe, at just about every major global intersection. Additionally, proof of giants has been found all over the world as well. For example, as recently as 2016, researchers in China uncovered giant human skeletons in over 200 tombs. These skeletons weren't too enormous, only up to a maximum of 6 feet 2 inches in height. But still, considering they were from 5,000 years ago, they were ridiculously tall. Even at just 6 feet, you would be insanely tall today. But in Neolithic China, where people generally only grew to be about 5 feet tall max, these people would have been considered literal giants. According to Feng Hui, head of the Shandong University's School of History and Culture, the individuals may have grown so large because they had access to better food than other people. However, if this were true, why aren't people growing over 6 feet tall today? Now we need to go across the planet to a favorite American vacation spot. Just 40 miles north of the Ozarks in Missouri, 7 skeletons were discovered in April of 1934. These skeletons measured over 8 feet in height, and it's not the only place in the Western Hemisphere where this kind of discovery was made. Giant skeletons have also been found in South America and Ecuador. So either there really was a race of giants once living on just about every continent, or there were just a few hotspots where giant people thrived and eventually went extinct. The Sumerian Birdman. The Sumerian Birdman is a strange phenomenon that suggests the ancient Sumerians had a presence in South America. Sculptures and carvings of a Sumerian god named Oannes, an amphibious being who rose from the ocean to teach mankind cosmic wisdom, are ripe throughout much of ancient Mesopotamia, but they've also been found in Ecuador, just a little different. The Sumerian carvings show a god walking upright, one arm bent in front of his face, holding a mysterious handbag in the other. Carvings uncovered in Ecuador show the exact same thing. The only difference is, instead of having the face of a man and the head of a fish, the carvings found in Ecuador show a being with the head of an eagle. But the position is exactly the same, with the left hand clutching a mysterious bag and the right hand bent in front of the face. They could be exact copies of each other if not for the difference in heads. Now things get even stranger as we take a look at ancient Assyria. An identical figure as the one seen in Ecuador was discovered at the ancient palace of Sargon of Akkad. This particular statue appears to be holding a piece of maize, corn that was grown by the Maya and not even known about by the rest of the world until the 1400s. The obvious connection here is that the old kingdoms of Mesopotamia were in direct contact with the Mesoamerican cultures of South America and Central America thousands of years before the Maya even existed. How this is possible is a complete mystery. The death of a genius. Stephen Hawking is one of the most renowned geniuses of all time. The accomplished physicist and cosmologist became world famous for both his scientific breakthroughs and for continuing with his lifelong work through a decades-long battle with ALS. Even after the disease paralyzed Hawking and rendered him unable to speak, he found ways to still research, communicate, and share his knowledge with the world. He passed away at his home in England on March 14, 2018, at the age of 76. It didn't take long for people to notice that Hawking died on Pi Day, which celebrates the mathematical constant pi. This seemingly never-ending number is expressed with the first 3 digits, 3.14, hence why Pi Day is on March 14th. Hawking also passed away on what would have been Albert Einstein's 139th birthday, and the 300th anniversary of Galileo's death. It seems fitting that he's in the company of other geniuses. He was cremated and interred at Westminster Abbey, where his memorial stone reads, "Here lies what was mortal of Stephen Hawking." It's also inscribed with his most famous mathematical equation. Just like the great minds who share Pi Day with Hawking in one way or another, the physicist's legacy endures. His final words were shared from beyond the grave via the Smithsonian Channel documentary Leaving Earth, or How to Colonize a Planet. In 2019, the British Royal Mint even released a commemorative coin in Hawking's honor. But even without all these tributes, he made a big enough mark on history to never be forgotten. The Great Henges. Nobody knows why ancient people built Stonehenges all over the world. Wherever ancient civilizations rose up, henges of huge rock boulders were constructed. Stonehenge just so happens to be the most famous, located in rural England. But the truth is that similar Stonehenges can be found all the way from the frigid mountains to hot deserts. We have the Carnac stones in Brittany, France, a grouping of over 3,000 stones that have been around since 4500 BC. There is the Rejum El Hiri in Israel, a megalithic monument of over 40,000 rocks. It was created around the year 3000 BC, and its purpose still remains unknown to archaeologists. Then there are some in Spain, other parts of Europe, and several countries of Africa. Then, of course, there are more stone circles all around the UK, the Drombeg Stone Circle in Ireland, the Rollright Stones in England, and the Callanish Stones in Scotland. This is just to name a few. The similarities between the different stone structures are uncanny, and yet nobody can come to a conclusion as to why our ancient ancestors all seem to have gotten the same idea to build the same thing at the same time. Pi and the Pyramid. John Taylor was the first one to suggest that the builders of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, the biggest pyramid in Giza, had incorporated the number pi into its design. He said that if you divided the perimeter of the pyramid by its height, you could obtain a reasonable approximation of pi. Not the exact thing, but pretty close. This made him theorize that the ancient builders had intended the pyramid to be a representation of Earth. The perimeter was supposed to correspond to the circumference of the equator. His ideas were published in a book about the pyramid back in 1859. After that, more and more scientists got on board with the theory of pi. We now know that if you divide the perimeter of the Great Pyramid by its height, you get an approximation of pi within 0.04% accuracy. The same can be said when adding up the slope of each face of the pyramid. The level of accuracy here seems absolutely ridiculous. If, of course, the theories are correct, it would mean that the Egyptians had mastered the art of math. And why not? If they really had used this pyramid as an approximate representation of the planet, it would mean they had somehow measured the entire globe. And this does not seem like something they could have done. But maybe they had more knowledge of the stars and of math than we give them credit for. But the remaining question is this: did the Egyptians really try to incorporate the mathematics of pi into the pyramid, or is it all just a surprising coincidence? The Code of Hammurabi versus the laws of today. The Code of Hammurabi was written sometime between 1792 and 1750 BC under the Babylonian king Hammurabi. Coincidentally, this very first complete written legal system had a lot in common with our own code of laws today. The code is a collection of approximately 282 rules, which established a standard of social interactions with a set list of fines and punishments depending on what a person did. The code, so that nobody could miss it, was carved onto a giant black pillar, which was discovered by archaeologists in 1901. At the very top of the pillar was a carved relief of Hammurabi himself, receiving the list of laws from the Babylonian god of justice Shamash. And yes, this is quite similar to the story of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments in the Bible. It's just that this happened several thousand years earlier. The rest of the pillar, about 7 feet 6 inches of black stone, is covered in cuneiform script, detailing the complex legal system. And while some of the punishments for breaking laws were pretty harsh, like the guilty person having their tongue cut off or their hands removed, one thing is identical to the United States legal system of today. After a person was accused of a crime, even 4,000 years ago, they were considered innocent until proven guilty. But at the same time, if a man was caught stealing an ox, the punishment was that he would have to pay back 30 times the value of the ox. So not exactly like the laws of today, but pretty close. Ancient basketball. One of the most bizarre cultural similarities that we share today with the ancient Maya of yesterday is basketball. What a lot of people don't know is that the ancient Maya loved playing ball games. A construction crew working in the Yucatan recently stumbled upon one of these ancient ball courts near the Technological University in Mérida. Archaeologists were called to the scene and were shocked when they realized they were standing in a ball court where the Maya played a very primitive version of basketball that involved human sacrifice. The game was called Tlachtli, and it was played as far back as the Olmec and as recently as the Aztec. The point of the game was to throw a ball through a hoop at either end of a court. If that sounds familiar, it's because that's the point of basketball. The only difference with the Maya game is that they were not allowed to use their hands. They had to kick the ball through the extremely narrow hole in the stone hoop. This made it an incredibly difficult game. And to make things even harder, the losers of the game sometimes had their heads chopped off. Nobody knows for sure if this was the original inspiration for the game of basketball played today, but it is a pretty big coincidence that the Maya and Aztec played a game almost identical to our very own basketball. Abe Lincoln's son witnessed 3 presidential assassinations. Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, narrowly escaped death as a child when a stranger saved him from getting run over by a train. Robert had leaned up against a stopped train in New Jersey and nearly fell onto the tracks when it started to move again. Just in the nick of time, a man grabbed the boy by the collar and pulled him to safety. That man was Edwin Booth, an actor and the brother of John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated Honest Abe years later. As if that chance encounter wasn't strange enough, Robert ended up witnessing 3 presidential assassinations throughout his lifetime. He wasn't at the Ford's Theater when his father was shot, but he rushed to Lincoln's deathbed and stayed by his side until he died from his injuries. Over the following years, many Republicans pressured Robert to enter a career in politics. He wasn't particularly interested in doing so, but eventually relented and became the Secretary of War under President James A. Garfield. One day, as Robert approached Garfield, a man named Charles Guiteau shot the president twice. Garfield died from his wounds 8 days later. Robert left politics, understandably so, but instead took a high-ranking position with the Pullman Rail Car Company. But it didn't spare him from witnessing yet another presidential assassination in 1901. While traveling that year, the Lincolns made a last-minute decision to stop in Buffalo to visit the Pan American Exposition. The moment Robert stepped off the train, he received a telegram informing him that President William McKinley had been shot by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz. Lincoln visited McKinley, who was resting after surgery. It seemed like he was going to live, but the president died from an infection a week later. At some point during his life, Robert became convinced that he was cursed. And who can blame him? In addition to experiencing 3 presidential assassinations, all his brothers had died tragically, and his mother spent her final years of life in an insane asylum. It seemed like death followed Robert wherever he went, and he never managed to escape it. Missing noses. Anyone who's ever taken a trip to Egypt has probably wondered what the deal is with all the statues missing their noses. Is it a coincidence that so many great monuments lost their nose? It is and it isn't. If you take a good hard look at the Sphinx, you'll notice it too has its nose broken off. Statues at the Brooklyn Museum have missing noses, and in just about every Egyptian temple that still stands, there are statues with no noses. So what's the deal? The ancient Egyptians had a firm belief that when they built a sculpture to personify someone, that someone's soul could occupy the sculpture. When there was trouble in Egyptian society, usually having to do with a specific ruler, this ruler would sometimes break the noses off the statues of his rival or his rival's ancestors as a way to show strength. The destruction of the nose was almost always politically or religiously motivated. The nose in particular was smashed because the Egyptians believed it would cause the spirit residing in the statue to stop breathing. Later on, grave robbers did the same thing with the statues of the tombs or temples they were pillaging. They believed that by smashing the nose and stopping the statue from breathing, it wouldn't have the power to smite them down for stealing their stuff. Eve and Pandora. There's a very strange coincidence surrounding the Bible and a story from Greek mythology. It involves the very first woman ever created. In the Bible, the first woman was named Eve. This is spoken of in Genesis. After God created Adam from the dust of the ground, he created Eve using Adam's rib. At the time, there was no death or suffering, there wasn't a speck of evil in the world, and everything was smooth sailing. But in the end, Eve ate the forbidden fruit against the orders of God, and because of her sin, death and suffering swept into the world and evil made its first appearance. In Greek mythology, the first woman on the planet was Pandora. She was made from the water and earth, kind of like Adam, and then given a box that contained all the evil in the world. At the time of her creation, the world was a paradise. There was no death or suffering, and there was no evil. The evil was trapped in Pandora's box, which she was told never to open. But just like Eve, Pandora became curious and opened the box. Because of her curiosity, after breaking the rules, she unleashed evil on a global scale. Chronologically speaking, the story of Pandora came first. It's impossible to say whether the Bible copied the story. We have to admit there are quite a few similarities. In both cases, the first woman is blamed for the origin of evil in a world that was formerly a perfect paradise. Coincidence? What do you think? Bucket and cone. What is the symbolic significance of the bucket and cone, depicted in art that is widespread throughout the ancient world? Archaeologists seem to have no idea. The bucket and cone are seen with deities represented in old Mesopotamian structures and in art from the more recent Neo-Assyrian Empire. There are dozens of reliefs showing a wide variety of deities holding what appears to be a pine cone in their right hand and a bucket or handbag in their left. Some have actually claimed these deities are the Anunnaki, a supposed race of ancient aliens that once enslaved humanity and forced our ancient ancestors to mine gold for them. But of course, there is no proof of this. A more logical explanation for the widespread bucket and cone symbolism is that they were both objects used in purification rituals going back over 5,000 years. The cone was dipped in a bucket of water, then shook over a person to purify them. There is a lot of speculation that the bucket and cone are clues to a more complex human history, but the truth is probably quite simple. The reason these symbols are seen throughout so much of the old world is simply because the purification ritual was quite popular. As for the cone, well, it's been a symbol of fertilization for thousands of years. Ancient cannabis. As it turns out, ancient cultures from all over the world had one specific plant that they really enjoyed smoking. This is the cannabis plant, the one that is still extremely popular and very controversial to this day. In ancient Egypt, cannabis was used to treat a wide variety of ailments, things like glaucoma and feminine health, as well as pain management in general. The use of cannabis has been described in ancient Egyptian texts going by the name Shemshemet. This stuff was also used in funeral rituals in ancient Egypt and during the mummification process. Archaeologists were shocked when they discovered cannabis pollen on the mummified remains of Ramses the Great, the famous pharaoh who died in 1213 BC. Even more shocking is that the highest concentration of THC, the chemical in cannabis that causes a person to become intoxicated, was found inside the lungs. This suggests it was smoked. Scientists also found nicotine and cocaine along with the THC, hinting that the Egyptians partied pretty hard. But it wasn't only the Egyptians who smoked the stuff. Evidence of cannabis use has been found in China, Israel, Greece, India, Rome, and all throughout North America and South America. In ancient times, cannabis was one of the most popular plants grown and smoked by just about everyone. Man survives 2 atomic bombs. The United States dropped atomic bombs over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th in 1945. At least 214,000 civilians are believed to have died in the explosions. But one man, a marine engineer named Tsutomu Yamaguchi, managed to defy the odds and survived both bombings. The Japanese government confirmed in 2009 that Yamaguchi was in each city on the days of the blasts. On August 6th, he was in Hiroshima on business. He later told the press that as he was walking along, he heard a lone airplane approach. Yamaguchi saw something drop from the plane, but only got a quick glance before he saw a huge flash in the sky and was knocked over. He returned home to Nagasaki and went back to work immediately despite being wounded. 3 days after the Hiroshima explosion, Yamaguchi was forced to relive the traumatic experience. Thankfully, he lived. In addition to being incredibly lucky to survive in the first place, Yamaguchi lived to the age of 93, despite being exposed to huge amounts of radiation. He's one of 70 people who are believed to have survived both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, but he's the only person that the Japanese authorities have officially recognized for doing so. Thanks for watching! If you'd like to learn about more shocking historical coincidences, let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time! Bye!